And I know it's been a long day and you're all tired, but bear with me in the last presentation. I promised to keep it short and engaging. So I'm Matthew. I'm a PhD student at the University of South Carolina. I'm working at IVERS Research Lab. To give you a short context about our research that we are doing at IVERS, we actually use systems and artificial intelligence method to kind of improve decision making when it comes to water resources management, as well as managing other environmental resources. So today I'm going to present a new research that my colleagues and I have been working on recently, which is titled Mapping Risk Coastal Vulnerability from South Carolina to the East Coast. Here is a brief overview of what I'm going to be talking about in the next 15 to 20 minutes. So first, I will introduce the previous work that we have done and the attention that it has got all through the related media. Then I will be explaining the data that we used and the data preparation process, all the challenges that we faced. And I guess if you're also doing some extensive data GIS work to drive some geospatial insight, this part would be helpful for you as well. Then I will explain the methodology that we used. We have done it with two different methodologies, multi-criteria decision making, which I will go through in depth, and then I will mention also the second methodology very briefly, because it's not GIS related, the probabilistic principal component analysis. Then I will spend the last 5 to 10 minutes showing the outputs of our work and the vulnerability maps that we developed. And at the end, I will have a few slides showing how we are expanding, building upon this work to kind of develop something even better than this. So moving on to the introduction, on the left side of the screen, you can see our paper published in Scientific Reports of Nature, which is a very prestigious journal, and it was featured on websites or the newsletters of the institutions such as South Carolina Office of Resilience, Oak Ridge National Laboratory, American Geophysical Union, or NOAA, which stands for National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. So given this wide outreach, we decided to build up on this work and expand it in two different dimensions, which I will explain in future slides. Moving on with the input data and data preparation, well, for this study, we considered 20 different factors, and we grouped them in 5 different categories, as you can see here: hydroclimate, physical, socioeconomic, ecological, and shoreline. So to mention just a few of these factors that we have studied, I can mention, as you can see here, the number of coastal events, elevation data, species richness, and significant wave height. But as you can see here, the data are from different natures. We cannot easily aggregate the data for elevation with the data for species richness, right? They don't speak the same language. And I guess it's a very common problem for anyone who is working with GIS related data as well. So first we had to figure out how to kind of normalize these data into a comparable scale so that we can aggregate and analyze them all together. For this purpose, we could have used different methods. The first method that we could have used was min-max method or the z-score method. The problem with the min-max method though was when we have outlier data, the min-max method does not perform good. But on the other hand, the z-score method performs good on the outlier data as well. But it has another problem. When it comes to kind of data with complex or let's say non-linear relationships, z-score method cannot capture those relationships. What do I mean by non-linear relationships? Think of elevation data, for example. In lower elevation, let's say from 1 to 5 meters above the sea level height, when we increase the elevation as low as 1 meter, like going from 4 to 5 meters above the sea level, the vulnerability drops significantly. But the same amount of increase in the elevation, let's say from 50 to 51 meter, it does not affect the vulnerability to oceanic floods that much, right? So these kind of relationships are hard to be captured by z-score method. Therefore, we decided to go on with the fuzzy logic based actually normalization method. So what is fuzzy logic membership functions? These 3 pictures, I've taken them from the ArcGIS Pro documentation. You can find them online in this link below. But let's see, what are these? The first one actually is the fuzzy linear membership function. It's basically used when there is a linear, let's say, relationship between the data and vulnerability. It can be either increasing or decreasing, but we need this relationship to be able to be modeled with a linear function. We use this for values or factors such as rainfall intensity. Consider there is an area with 1 millimeter per hour of rainfall, right? And we have another area with 4 millimeter per hour of rainfall. The vulnerability of the second one is higher than the first one. And this change, this increase happens steadily across a linear function. So we use this function to model those kind of data. The second function that we used was fuzzy small membership function. So how does it work? This one actually is used when the lower values for functions, the lower values for factors are associated with higher values of vulnerability. Can you think of any factors among the first 20 factors that has this kind of characteristics? Like the lower values of that are associated with higher vulnerabilities? The simplest one, the elevation data, right? At lower elevation, we have higher vulnerability. So this is how we use this small membership function. The last fuzzy membership function that we used is fuzzy large membership function, which works exactly opposite of the previous one, the small membership function. It is used when basically the higher values of factors are associated with higher values of vulnerability. We use this one to kind of normalize the data such as storm surge height, right? The higher the height of the storm, the higher the vulnerability. So now we have our data normalized into a scale of 0 to 1. We can move on with our methodology. As I mentioned, we have two different methodologies. The first one, multi-criteria decision making. What is MCDM? Well, it's actually a method that helps us to kind of evaluate and prioritize when we have multiple criteria involved in our decision making. So now, so far, we have our data normalized into a comparable scale of 0 to 1. We need to assign weight to them and then aggregate them together, right? So in order to assign weight, you could have again used a couple of functions, but among all of these, we decided to go with entropy-based weighting method because the other methods were either oversimplified, like equal weighting method, which is basically assigning the same weight to all factors, or they were very subjective, like expert judgment or Delphi method, or they were too time consuming because in this study we have used 20 factors. In our next study, which I'm going to explain later, we are considering over 150 factors. So using methods such as Topsys or Delphi would be extremely time consuming. So anyways, we ended up using the entropy-based weighting method for this. So how does this work? It actually helps us figure out which criteria are more important based on their variation. What does it mean? It basically, it might sound a bit counterintuitive in the beginning, but think of it like this. When a factor, a variable, varies a lot across different regions, it is less consistent, right? When a factor is less consistent, it's not as reliable, so we assign a lower weight to it. And it works the other way around as well. When a factor, a variable does not vary that much across the regions, it is more consistent, so it is more reliable. We will assign a higher weight to that. So anyways, we have so far our data normalized and we have assigned them weights as well, right? Now it's time to aggregate the data together. For data aggregation, there are basically two different methods, multiplicative methods and additive methods with a formula on the board that you can see. But here, the multiplicative methods are basically used when there are kind of a strong relationships and interactions between different factors. Like when one factor can amplify or diminish the effect of all other factors. We didn't have these specific characteristics in our data, so we decided to use the additive method. It is mostly used when the data, the factors that are concerned, work independently to build the final result that we want. So anyways, so far we have our data normalized, assigned weight, and we have them aggregated together. Here also you can see on the left hand side, it's the step-by-step framework for multi-criteria decision making that I explained, starting from rasterizing the data to kind of, let's say, putting them in different groups, normalizing the data, and assigning weight to them with entropy-based weighting method. On the other hand, we have the probabilistic principal component analysis method. It is not a GIS-based related method. I would say it's more of a mathematical probabilistic method. So how does it work? It actually finds out the most significant components by performing some probabilistic analysis on them. And after that, it will use some complexity reduction functions to reduce the complexity of the data and find the underlying patterns and relationship between the data. Then it will use those data to kind of create the coastal vulnerability index. So here, now we have our data normalized, assigned weight, aggregated together. Now we can move to our output and results of our work. So as I mentioned, we have studied 20 different factors, divided them in 5 different groups. Here are the groups that you can see. And for each group, we have developed a separate vulnerability index. So here, the first one, let's start with the physical vulnerability map. Oh my God, it's hard to pronounce it. So the red color indicates more vulnerable areas, and the blue color less vulnerable, right? A specific feature to this map, something to notice is like the areas closer to the coast, to the shoreline, are more vulnerable, and this is what we expect, right? But this is not the case for all different vulnerability types. Like when I bring up the socioeconomic vulnerability map, you can see that it's actually vice versa. So to develop the physical vulnerability map, we used 4 different data: elevation, soil water storage, distance from the coast, and curve number. The first 3 are kind of self-explanatory, but anyone knows what is curve number that is grouped here among physical factors? Okay, so curve number is a parameter that kind of explains how much of the rainfall would turn into runoff. So basically, it's a function of soil type, the hydrological status of the region, and the land use. So anyways, the second group of vulnerability was hydroclimate vulnerability that we studied. Similar to the physical vulnerability, it also has higher values for vulnerability all across the shoreline. But there's something different in this one comparing with the physical vulnerability. If you look at the Charleston County vulnerability, it has kind of it is homogeneously vulnerable across the shoreline. But in the hydroclimate vulnerability map, we can see that the northern part of Charleston has much higher vulnerability index comparing with the southern part, right? So the next one, and also for this one, actually, we used 4 different, let's say, factors: number of coastal hazard events, cyclone track density, rainfall intensity, and surge height. The third vulnerability index that we calculated is the socioeconomic vulnerability. For this one, we also studied 3 different factors: cost of fatalities, number of historical structures, and SOVI factor, or social vulnerability index, which was again developed by Hazard Vulnerability Institute of University of South Carolina a couple of years ago. And also here, if you compare it to the first 2 maps, the relationship that I mentioned there is not valid anymore. So it's not that the further we go from the coastline, the socioeconomic vulnerability decreases. And specifically, on the county on the top left, you can see that the further we go from the coastline, the vulnerability actually increases. So it's something also that you can think of. The 4th factor was ecological vulnerability index, or ECI. In this one, we focused on ecosystem factors. We studied shellfish harvesting area, turtle sites, and species distribution. Last but not least, we did a vulnerability index on shoreline. As you can see, this one is a line feature, not a polygon, unlike the others. So for this one, we studied 5 different factors: the coastal slope, rate of shoreline change, beachfront stability, tide range, and significant wave height. So these were the 5 different vulnerability indexes that we used. Something that I missed to mention about data aggregation, we had two different levels of data aggregation. The first one was putting the individual factors together to create these 5 vulnerability maps. And the second level of aggregation, which again we used the additive method for this, was putting these 5 vulnerability maps to create the final CVR or coastal vulnerability indexes that I will present in the next slide. So these two, CVI 50 is the coastal vulnerability index for average condition, CVI 90 is the same coastal vulnerability index for extreme condition, and you can see the red areas are much more in the CVI 90. So this was kind of the result of an output of our work, but as I said, we are building on this work in our ongoing next work. I mentioned that we are kind of expanding the previous work in 2 different dimensions. What are those 2? The first one is moving our focus from vulnerability to the concept of risk. I will explain it later. And the second one was kind of our area of interest. In the previous work, as I explained, we studied the east coast parts of South Carolina. So it was 5-6 counties only. But in our next work, we are studying the whole east coast of the United States. So it's almost 200 counties. It's a huge increase. But what do I mean by changing our focus from vulnerability to risk? Well, we know that risk is a function of 3 different components, right? Hazard, exposure, vulnerability. If these terms are kind of not so familiar for you, I put the definitions published by IPCC, Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change, here. So let's just read them together. Risk is defined as the potential for adverse consequences for human or ecological systems, recognizing the diversity of values and objectives associated with such systems. Then we have hazard. So hazard is defined as the potential occurrence of a natural or human-induced physical event or trend that may cause loss of life, injury, or other impacts. Exposure, the second most important factor in risk, it is defined as the presence of people, livelihood, infrastructures, and social or cultural assets in places that would or could be adversely affected. The last factor contribute to risk is vulnerability, as it was the topic of our previous paper. Vulnerability is defined as the propensity to be adversely affected and encompasses a variety of concepts and elements, including sensitivity and susceptibility. So there are 2 different drivers for vulnerability. One of them is the susceptibility, and the second one is lack of adaptive capacity. So this is what I mean when I said we shift our focus from vulnerability to risk. We are kind of considering a bigger picture rather than focusing only on vulnerability of the coastal areas. We are studying the vulnerability, we are studying the hazard separately, we are studying the exposure, the presence of people according to the definition, and we are putting them together to create the risk itself. So that was it for my presentation today. You can scan this barcode to keep in touch with me if you have any ideas for collaboration, anything that we can talk about, and if you have any questions, I'd be happy to take them. Sure.
As you expand your study across the East Coast, what do you see as the greatest barrier to success in replicating this on such a grand scale?
I would say data availability. Of course, it's actually the answer for all these kind of questions for this area. But yeah, the greatest challenges that both in the first study and second study that we are dealing with is the data availability, because we are getting, as I mentioned, we are studying close to more than actually 150 different factors to study the concept of the risk. For vulnerability, it was easier and more manageable, but for risk, there are data from different sectors, not all of them are publicly available, so we need to kind of reach out to different people to see if they would like to kind of share their data with us or not, or some data that we are getting from satellite imaging, the remote sensing data, they might be kind of covered with clouds or all those different challenges that we might face with. Yeah, I would say the data availability was is still the greatest challenge that we're dealing with. Any questions?
You mentioned like different type of agencies, like what are some, like, I guess, examples they reach out to if that's something?
Sorry, could you repeat your question?
I just like what type of organizations you might have reached out to for data. I know you mentioned that.
Actually, that part of work is being done by a colleague of mine. The data collection, I'm more working on performing the geospatial analysis. But I know that they have reached out to the counties, administrative people of the counties themselves. I'm not sure what the organizations are called, but I know that for each county they have reached out to them to get some data. They have got most of them now, luckily, but they're still struggling and having some back and forth communication with them.
What's your timeline for expanding your analysis? When do you think you'll have some results from that?
We have already done the hazard part. Now we are working on exposure and vulnerability. So I would say the work would hopefully be ready like in a span of like 2 to 3 months. Any questions? Great. So thank you all. I guess we can all go to the presidential